Widespread protests in Kenya against proposed new taxes. Police criticised for using excessive force. Many on the streets are young, mobilised by social media. Why is the government pushing the new taxes? And why has there been such a reaction? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Elizabeth Puranam. Fierce protests across Kenya, violent crackdown by police and the worst unrest since President William Ruto came to power less than 2 years ago. It was all triggered by government efforts to increase taxes to help cut the national debt and pay back its lenders, including China and the International Monetary Fund. Young people have led the protests, with social media prominent too. Police have used gunfire on peaceful protests, with fatalities, injuries and mass arrests condemned by civil liberties groups. The government has offered some concessions, but it hasn't eased the tension. So why has this bill brought so much anger, and what are the wider implications? We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Laura Khan.
Undeterred by clouds of choking tear gas, these young Kenyans are taking to the streets in their thousands with a clear demand. They oppose the government's plan to raise $2.7 billion in additional taxes, under pressure from the International Monetary Fund. The protest, dubbed Occupied Parliament, started in Nairobi on Tuesday and have since spread nationwide.
This bill, we can't let it pass. We want to reject it completely, and that's why we're here. It's our duty to protest against the bill.
Kenya is led by poverty. We have no education. Most of our people are unlearned. They cannot write, they cannot read. And the government still wants to pull away the budget.
Roads around Parliament were sealed, with both the noise and the message seemingly not reaching politicians. They held a second reading of the bill on Tuesday, but not all agreed.
This bill was a disaster. This bill is assuming that the Kenyans' tax rate should move to a higher rate regime.
President William Ruto had made amendments to the bill, dropping levies on bread, transport of sugar, financial services and motor vehicle tax, proposing instead to increase fuel prices. The new budget is a response to the IMF, which has called the government to increase revenues to reduce its reliance on borrowing. But with high unemployment, inflation and a third of the country living in poverty, many see these additional taxes as punishing the poor. And the way police handled the protests may have worsened the anger on the streets. Gillian Munyeo says her son was shot dead while fleeing from tear gas.
If someone is fighting for their rights, why use live bullets? If he would have been found with any weapons, he would have said there is a problem, but he was walking with his friend.
Rights groups who attended Thursday's protests say spent cartridges implied the use of live rounds.
It's really shocking to learn that we are living in a country where youth are losing their lives for merely exercising their constitutional rights.
But nothing appears to deter these young Kenyans, who say they will remain on the streets until the government scraps its controversial plans to raise taxes. Laura Khan for Inside Story, Aljazeera.
Well, let's take a closer look at some of the items the new taxes will cover. Most of it will apply to imported goods, including phones, computers, motorcycles, which are a common form of transport. Value-added tax will also be doubled on petroleum products from 8 to 16%. Kenya is heavily reliant on diesel for transport and agriculture. But the government has dropped additional taxes on several items, including bread, sugar and vegetable oil. Proposed levies on sanitary products and diapers were also dropped. Let's bring in our guests. In Nairobi, Stella Agara, a tax justice activist, an Africa governance and security analyst. In London, Reginald Kadzutu, a finance economist at Oxford Brookes University. And also in Nairobi, Nicodemus Minde, a researcher with the East Africa Peace and Security Governance Programme at the Institute for Security Studies. A very warm welcome to each of you. And before we start, I would like to mention that we reached out to the Kenyan government and figures in Kenya who support its finance bill, but no one was available to join us on the programme. Nicodemus Minde, I'd like to start with you in Nairobi. There is so much to unpack in this programme, but before we get to some of the finer points, for our international audience, why is Kenya in this situation today?
Well, this is part of a bill that was introduced in Parliament in May, the finance bill, which is supplementary to the budget proposed for the year 2024-2025. And in it introduces a number of recommendations, especially on taxes, and revisions on taxes, especially on VAT, excess duty, as well as withholding tax. And as the report has mentioned, this has actually led to a lot of disapproval by many of the Kenyan citizens because it targets, the essential commodities and products, which has really impacted the lives of the people because of increased taxation. And it is also part of an increased tax burden on Kenyan citizens, especially it came at a time when the previous finance bill of 2023 also introduced a housing levy, which has also compounded to the greater tax burden and, of course, the difficult in terms of living standards of the people.
Mr. Kadzutu, as Mr. Minde mentioned, there have been a number of taxes that have been already imposed on the Kenyan people. How is it that the government decided what to tax in its effort to raise revenues, in its latest efforts?
From an economic perspective, if you want to widen a tax base where you have not widened the income base, you have to move away from direct taxes. So if you look at the previous regime and the Ruto regime and the first part of the Ruto regime, they were mainly targeting PAYE, corporate tax, and the salaried employees. But you can only get as much from them. So for their unsatisfiable hunger for generating revenue, made them now to start going for indirect taxes, because that's an easier way of just widening the tax base, because it affects everyone. So when you start taxing bread, edible oil, fuel, and all, that means you go to every individual, because as long as you consume, then you will pay tax. It is said for those on the bottom of the pyramid, but also even said for even those who have an income, because then you are paying PAYE, then you still go pay a consumption tax on top of your salary that has already been taxed. So the reason why they have gone now for indirect taxes or taxes on consumption is that they've realized you can't widen the tax base with those who are salaried, so they're trying to go for everyone.
Okay. And Ms. Agara, what is it about these proposed tax reforms that's got, people, especially the youth, out onto the streets when they have previously been uninterested in government affairs?
Elizabeth, I think there are a number of things that have gotten the youth interested in this particular finance bill. The first thing is the fact that there was unfinished business in the finance bill from last year. When the conversation was being held on the finance bill last year, a good number of them did not understand what the fuss was about, and they thought that the protests that were held last year were a disturbance. But then after a few months, especially when some of those taxes came to force, then they started realizing that it was affecting them directly and affecting their parents' ability to give them a certain lifestyle. Of course, this year, this particular finance bill, 2024-2025, has also touched a very sensitive area. It has touched women, especially by using taxes on sanitary towels. It has attacked gender roles, especially on the use of diapers and the needs for women to access diapers. It has attacked unemployed youth who happened to be the target of His Excellency the President's campaign in the last election that got him into power. And he kept on speaking to unemployed youth. He was calling them hustlers. He identified with them. He woke them up. Any political party in this world knows that you do not wake up this group when you do not have a plan for them. As soon as you wake them up, as soon as they know what they deserve and what their rights are, it becomes very difficult to settle them. And I think that's what has caused this kind of energy from Gen Z, this kind of energy from the millennials to actually find its way into the clamor for a better finance bill, at least this year.
Okay. I wonder if this bill can be made better for people. Nicholas Minde, Ms. Agara was talking about, the taxes on menstrual products for women and nappies, both of which have very recently been dropped. The proposed taxes on those things, the proposed taxes on bread has also been dropped because of the protests. So do you think that we could see the government roll back some of the other proposals? The fact that the taxes on, bread, menstrual products, nappies have been dropped, how much is it a victory for protesters, and can we see more?
It was a good thing that the pressure actually yielded to some of those amendments, especially this proposed 16% VAT on a product that was previously zero rate. This is bread and gluten. And of course, the previous tax, there was also a recommendation on 2.5% on motor vehicles, which was then again dropped. And of course, also the financial services, which include, the daily lives of people who are transacting with the M-Pesa, which is, digital monies and all that. It was a good thing that the government almost listened. But again, if you look at the proposed bill, the finances, as Stella has mentioned, as well as my colleague Reginald has mentioned, it still covers to a great extent these salaried employees and taxing these unemployed youth who really rely on digital content creation and all that. So as where we have so far reached in terms of the second reading of the bill, you find that maybe it would have been more pressure is needed, but the government is still intent on passing this particular bill, because as the government has also mentioned, if this bill is actually shut down, it will also be seen as being having no confidence on the government, because this bill is also directly tied to the budget process of 2024-2025. So that therefore is the dilemma for this for the bill and the protesters at large.
And Mr. Kadzutu, could we see increased taxes on other goods or, in fact, new items to replace the levies that have been scrapped over the last few days? I mean, one of the criticisms of this Kenyan government is that the items that are taxed keep changing all the time. Again, this time we're talking specifically about proposals, but in a broader context, that the items that are taxed are constantly being changed.
I think there's uncertainty that comes with the fiscal policy in Kenya, not even just for the Ruto regime only, but even for the previous regimes, where every tax year there are new tax proposals, causes a lot of problems for the economy in general, especially going forward, because then you cannot plan long term. So, for example, you have infrastructure bonds which were tax exempt. Now they are proposing on putting withholding tax. In anyone who's holding that infrastructure bond is already thinking, I was supposed to get 16% tax-free. Now 20% of that is going to go to withholding tax. They were planning on raising 354 billion on these new tax proposals. So one thing they've done after they've dropped all the other things that they managed to drop, they increased road levy by 39% to around 25 shillings per litre. And now the ripple effects of increasing the price of petroleum products or fuel is that transport costs will go up, electricity costs will go up, food costs will go up, because the transport of the cost of transporting food from the farm to the shop, from the factory to the shop, has gone up with that road levy. So they have to find another way of raising that 354 billion, unless then they do cuts on the appropriation bill and reduce expenditure by the equivalent amount of money. I don't think they'll take something else. They'll most probably either add it to borrowing, and Kenya remains in the same or deeper.
Yeah, absolutely, because one of the reasons why Kenya is in this situation is because of the borrowing. Ms. Agara, if you look at the protests, one of the reasons why demonstrators are saying they're out on the streets is because of corruption in the government. And while the government is raising taxes, they're not adequately addressing the corruption that also affects the revenues that go towards government spending. How much of a problem would you say corruption is at the moment, and is the government doing enough about it?
Corruption is a huge problem in Kenya. I don't think this is anything that we need to belabor for anyone, because many people have had the many reports on corruption that have come out of Kenya. The biggest challenge that we're having with this government is that there's an increase in runaway corruption. With the coming into office of the president, he managed to get very many people who had active cases in court pardoned and getting away with very small fines for some of their corruption cases. His government has also had several scandals linked to corruption that are going to be impacting on the lives of Kenyan citizens, because that's money lost from the economy that will never be recovered. Kenyans happen to have a very vibrant media that keeps on informing them about these forms of corruption, and they follow the cases on a daily basis because Kenya is very politically active. So it puts us in a situation where the citizen understands what is being lost from the economy, and then they're also listening to the president, trying to convince them through his government that they need more resources to be able to run our country. Unfortunately, the feeling is that the amount of debt that they're incurring for this country is not being invested in the right area, and therefore doesn't make sense. But maybe let me add, Elizabeth, that even as this debt is being collected, it's supposed to be coming in for service delivery or coming in areas that are going to be making money for the economy. Unfortunately, they are investing in recurrent expenditure. They are wasting a lot of it in corruption. And when this is happening, they're imposing taxes on Kenyans that are going to increase the life of Kenyans. Reginald has spoken about some of the areas where they've increased taxes that may still affect people in the bill as it is now. Yeah. For example, the import levies. Kenya depends heavily on imports. I think the average from the records from 2021 is about 20 million USD worth of imports, which is about 2 billion Kenya shillings. I mean, you cannot cause an economy that depends on imports to pay extra taxes on imports, yet that cost is going to be transferred to the consumer eventually. Yeah, so it is a big problem.
Okay, and you've raised a lot of important points there, including, mismanagement. Mr. Minde, we've talked about, China is Kenya's largest lender, and the debt that, Kenya's debt to GDP ratio, I think, is around 70%. Many of the Chinese built and funded infrastructure projects are underutilized or haven't paid for themselves, as Kenya said they would. Just how much of a problem is mismanagement?
Well, there is a lot. If you look at the external, the budget that was raised, $31 billion for the year 2022, 2024, 2025, and not just about corruption. There is also monies that are being directed to things that are not very essential in terms of, for example, repairs of homes or payment of the spouses of this president and the deputy president, which again has really angered many Kenyans. So as much as we're talking about corruption, there's also misappropriation of money being directed elsewhere. But back to your question on China, there's a lot of concern about the growing budget crisis. And of course, if you look at the way the budget was actually structured, it's also about to deal with this external borrowing is a way to really offset the burgeoning external debt, which again is also a big problem because we see there's also a lot of angst amongst Kenyans, especially there's belief that maybe this particular finance bill has actually been drafted by external actors, especially the IMF, who are directly involved in terms of this financial institution. So there is that particular worry amongst the Kenyans.
Let me put that worry to Mr. Katsutu. Is it warranted? How involved, is the International Monetary Fund? How much oversight do they have in the Kenyan government setting its monetary policy and in these proposals?
Well, they're effectively a receiver or an administrator. When a company is about to liquidate, you get an administrator or a receiver to manage the affairs. The point where Kenya was a point where they needed the IMF or they were going to default. Some of the policies that have come from the IMF, as noble as they are, because IMF as an administrator or a receiver have to show the creditors that Kenya has the ability to pay. And the only way you have an ability to pay, like if you, Elizabeth, go to a bank to get a loan, they ask you for your payslip. Now, the payslip of a government is the amount of taxes that they are able to raise. I think the Kenyan government should not have chest thumped fact, when they got into power, saying that we will not default, we will pay, but they should have put their tails in between their legs and sat down with the creditors and said, how can we sort this out? For example, in this finance bill, or in the budget for this year, 1.8 trillion is going to debt repayment of finance of a budget of around 4 trillion. So literally half your budget is going to either redeeming debt or paying interest. So IMF had to come in, and for them to give you the money which Kenya has been using and give the Kenyan government the credibility that they can be able to access the international markets, because they had been frozen out, and they needed to show that IMF is in charge, IMF is helping. But if every review that IMF has been doing and the program that Kenya is on expires next year around March, one thing that the Kenyan government has been missing is the revenue targets that have been set by the IMF. But I think those proposals are a bit of a disconnect with the reality and the economic structure on the ground and the demographics on the ground. And they need to find another way of raising revenue to be able to repay domestic and external debt.
Ms. Agara, what could that other way be?
The other way, number one, is for the Kenyan government to listen to the Kenyan citizens more than they listen to the Bretton Woods institutions. Indeed, they have an obligation to repay debt, but then they need to first of all listen to the Kenyan citizens, because it is the Kenyan citizens who are generating these resources that they're going to use to pay for the debt, and then of course the direct investments. Number two is to make sure that there's more money in the hands of citizens. No economy has ever grown from taxing its people. Economies grow from having disposable income in the pockets of citizens. Disposable income that could be used to start businesses is used to trade, and therefore provides the resources that are needed for the government to tax. Increasing taxes in a space where citizens do not even have money to spend does not provide the kind of resources that then they're expecting to get their targets from. Number three is debt responsibility. Why are we repaying debt that has not been audited? We've never had a debt audit in Kenya. Nobody knows what they're repaying. They're also not giving us feedback to say this is what the debt that we took has paid for. Instead, Kenyans are constantly reminded that we're paying debt that is not covered. Then the last thing I will say on this is about ensuring that there's tax justice on this matter. When you are collecting taxes progressively, there's also supposed to be progressive spending of taxes. Corruption cannot be seen to be happening in a space where they're collecting these kinds of taxes. If they impose austerity measures on Kenyans, then they should also be seen to be exercising austerity on themselves and not investing on budgets for people who are not even within the constitution supposed to be given budgets from the tax of the Kenyans, including the chief minister.
Okay, thank you for that. We only have a few minutes left in the programme, and I'd like to cover a couple of very important points that we haven't yet. Mr. Minde, there are other African countries that are spending an even larger portion of their revenues on paying back debt at the moment. How will they be looking at what's happening in Kenya at the moment?
Interestingly, actually, if you look at the East African region, a country like Tanzania is also a big, if you look at the budget, that was also rate simultaneously with the Kenyan one. A big chunk of that money also goes into debt repayment. And of course, they'll be looking with a lot of interest what is happening in Kenya. Just yesterday, we saw the IMF extend another loan to Tanzania. So I think the government will also be very much worried in terms of what is actually happening.
Okay. And
Kenya, if you look at...
Okay, Mr. Kadzutu, there's so many reasons to be hopeful for Kenya, isn't there? There is the GDP growth, there's the young educated population, there's the use of green energy, it's online. What is it going to take at this point to realise that hope and potential and not squander it?
I think the first thing that the government of Kenya has to agree is that they actually do not have the capacity to repay this debt. And the first thing to do is to plug the hole that is making the debt continue to grow. That means overspending, looking at your expenditure versus your revenue, and not your fiscal deficit, which uses GDP as an indicator, because you can always inflate GDP and say our deficit is reducing, it's now 2% of GDP. But look at the difference between revenue and expenditure. For the last 6-7 years, the difference between revenue and expenditure has been around 40%. That means you're spending 40% more than you are collecting in revenue, and that now piles up to where they are right now. So unless they can reduce that deficit and say we're going to live within our means for now, there's no point of improving roads at the expense of where we are now. There's no point of building expressways. I know they want to build an expressway all the way to Mombasa, completely unnecessary. So if they can plug that leaking hole in their revenue right now for a couple of years, it might be painful, but it will get them out of the situation that they are currently in, and also start making sure that the taxes and the fiscal policies and the budget are going to areas that grow our export ability, increase incomes in the hands of the population. If they're able to do policies that do those two things and at the same time plug the hole, then the true Kenyan story will come out.
Yeah, so a lot of agreement there with Ms. Agara on how to fix this problem. Ms. Agara, just lastly, what is at stake for Kenya here, given, again, everything, all of the positive things that are happening in the country, and also the fact, that it is a stable country in a pretty unstable region?
First of all, let me register here that Kenya is still going to be a going concern even after this finance bill conversation. Kenya is still going to be functioning as a country even after this finance bill conversation. However, things will never be the same again, especially because Gen Z and the group of young people from the millennials who have found themselves in this clamor have tasted blood. They now know what it means to be on the streets fighting for their own rights. They have also heard from their parents saying that they've handed over to them to get the dream that we have constantly had for Kenya. They are very aware that the Bretton Woods institutions, including the IMF and World Bank, run a capitalist agenda that they are not interested in being a part of. And they're telling the government, we understand that we have an obligation, but as you negotiate with them, could you also check to see that the people you're trying to get these resources from are going to survive? They're also very aware that there are certain sectors that need to grow, including manufacturing that had zero-rated areas that are now going to be taxed. They are aware that there are certain agricultural components that are now going to be taxed. Unfortunately, they are also aware that there are taxes on phones and laptops that will affect their businesses they have. So in terms of the future, one of the things that the government of Kenya should wait for is that these people are not going to rest until something happens. I personally think that it is extremely important that we start preparing for unexpected action from citizens and maybe even an authorized action from citizens, because this is something that is coming in the near future.
Ms. Agara, thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but thank you to all of our guests. That is Stella Agara in Nairobi, Reginald Katsutu in London, and Nicholas Minde also in Nairobi. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. It's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Elizabeth Puranam, and the entire team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.